Hello and welcome. So we've been talking about Trump for 4 or 5 years, and finally the election is almost here, just 2 weeks away. We're going to delve a little bit into a couple of topics today. We're going to talk about what Trump has actually done. There's been a lot of talk about his tweets, what he says, how he behaves, but I think we would also like to talk a little bit about what is his actual accomplishments and what are the voters judging him on. And then we're going to go into more of the nuts and bolts of the election and talk a little bit about what it looks like now, what might happen on November 3rd and the week following November 3rd. So, and if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the future, but we'll see. And then we'll open up to questions from you guys. So you should think of some good ones while you sit and listen. So, Gunnar, I wanted to start by asking you about Trump's accomplishments. We know the big tax reform, that's probably his largest package. And there's been some small efforts at legislation. He's issued a lot of executive orders. Mm-hmm. How would you sort of judge him as far as if you could remove all his rhetoric and just look at what he's done? How would you judge him as a president?
My general sense, but first of all, thank you for this occasion. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for asking us these questions, Christina. I would think Trump in general will be considered as one of the greatest failure in US politics, including his legislative efforts. When people do these rankings, they cut them down into different topics, and one of those topics would be the legislative accomplishments. And I don't think it's so much that him as a person or him as an office, but that he has people who work for him who are negotiating with Congress and making legislation pass. So he's not in any way a Reagan or a Johnson in terms of being able to twist arms of legislators to get something passed. He just sits there and signs the bills when they come to his office. Of course, they act on his behalf and they try to accomplish his goals. But as a legislative player, he's pretty unaccomplished president. But you mentioned also, and I have to pick up that before Hilma maybe compliments what I'm saying, you mentioned his executive orders. And the state of US government these days is such that you get your policies through both by legislation, but that's a very cumbersome process because it takes so much collective action to get those guys moving. But then you have executive orders. You can implement things really fast, directly to the third branch of government. And he has done a lot of those things. But maybe sometimes at the spur of the moment, after watching Fox News in the morning, he sends those executive orders. And that just reflects how badly prepared his presidency has been in order to gain legislative accomplishments. He has had support of Congress in his first 2 years with a majority in the House, and also later in the Senate for the full 4 years. But in a sense, I don't think we can give him too much credit for whatever he has done. He's supposed to sign things, but that's what he's supposed to do.
Hilmar, do you think in the future, can people look back and sort of describe a Trump ideology, or is it just random pieces of opinion?
Probably closer to the latter. I actually have a paper coming out in about a month about Trumpism, what it is. Ideologically, it's basically a type of a crude nationalism, quite close to the European radical right in terms of the ideas, anti-immigration, authoritarianism in terms of law and order. But he himself, this is just kind of useful to him rhetorically. Trump himself really doesn't hold any core beliefs. He just wants to be liked, basically. I think he's extremely
narcissistic?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I wouldn't know. Well, I guess he appears that way, but vain was the word I was looking for. He's very vain. He enjoys the platform of the office. He just wants to be a political pundit, troll people. He doesn't really have an ideology. But Trumpism is also a way of communicating. It's a very crude, populistic way of communicating, which is being mimicked all across the Western world. So it's in part a set of ideas, nationalism, crude nationalism, a rhetorical style, just this alarmism, this kind of great man or belief in a great man approach to politics, the great leader, the dare leader stuff. Rhetorically, just celebrating, the genius of Trump. And finally, it's a way of, or it's a mode of political organization or political mobilization, I should say. It's a personalistic movement. And I think the toothpaste is out of the tube now. Trump is going to play some role in American politics in the years to come, one way or the other. Maybe just if he loses, he'll just go over to One American Network, this up and coming competitor to Fox News. Probably just gonna, this really pro-Trump network, just gonna probably become Trump TV. And he might run again in 2024 if he loses. But one way or another, he's turned the Republican Party into much more of a kind of European-style radical right-wing party. Yeah.
So what you're saying is that what will stand maybe in a few years is not necessarily his politics, but his methods might be something that is.
Yeah, well, there's going to be some kind of regrouping in the Republican Party, some kind of civil war about the future of the Republican Party if he loses. If he doesn't lose, if he wins, he's just going to be like more powerful than ever. Everybody's just going to be, celebrating him, adoring him, saluting him for the next 4 years in order to position themselves for a 2024 race. And if just follow up on what Gunnar said, I think he'll be remembered as a awful president too, but not because of his, the lack of accomplishments. I think he's actually accomplished quite a bit. He's done what he said about building the wall. He's building the wall. He has appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, which he very cleverly promised he would do. He has reshaped the federal courts, appointing some 200 plus federal judges, 3 justices. He has reshaped Middle Eastern policy, which I think is actually going to be really proved to be really significant in the long term. So I think he's actually accomplished quite a lot, but he's cheapened political discourse. And he has had a meta-political effect, which is not a good one. So I think for that reason, he'll be remembered as a bad president.
So when you say he's kept his promises, what do you think the Trump presidency looks like for the people who voted for him in 2016? What do they see today? Do they see a president who has accomplished what he told them that he would do? Do they see an America that they envisioned would be like this when they voted for Trump? And I'll kick this question to both of you.
Yeah, well, he's first and foremost a cultural warrior. That's how he's campaigning now. He's not even talking about his accomplishments.
Because he hasn't any.
Well, I disagree respectfully, but he would kick the table over. He would just bash the elites and all of that. And for a lot of people who have felt looked down upon by the establishment, the elites and all of that, that's actually an accomplishment. This whole kind of machismo act is very popular among the Republican grassroots. So in terms of just his cultural impact, him being out there, fighting for a small guy and all of that, I think it's not actually the case. Trump, he uses fighters. this tough guy, but he's not actually really fighting for any people. He's just fighting for his own kind of, or because of his own vanity. He's somebody insulted me, so I'm gonna hit back 10 times harder. All of that.
But it's also a question of political representation, right?
Yeah.
Which I think Sarah Palin sort of pioneered before him, where you had this person that nobody had ever seen before go into politics, and a large group of the population, I think, felt like, here's someone like me, someone representing me. I've never seen someone like this in politics before. So is there an effect from Trump where maybe he's bringing new groups into politics, getting them interested in politics in his own warped way?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way I am familiar with the United States, I don't think you can say that he's directly representing people, let's say in the Midwest, in Indiana, where I have been a couple of times. But they agree with him in his bashing of liberals and Democrats, which they hate for different reasons. So he has that role of helping them articulating and aggression towards somebody. Just a couple of points to what Hilma said about accomplishments. I accept it up to a point. In terms of his big tax cuts in 2017, that's an accomplishment. But it also added $1 trillion to the total debt of the United States. So it has a downside as well. You said about he was building the wall. He hasn't. He has just been mending fences for the existing wall. He has not been expanding the wall. So he's just been mending what's already there in the first place. And any Republican president could appoint just conservative judges, but that's more Mitch McConnell's job than the president. He's just signing it. He's just doing the job. So I don't see him going above and beyond what could be expected of a more proactive president. He has some achievements to in his belt, but not above and beyond what could be expected. So that's my take on it.
Do you want to?
Well, actually, we're talking about his accomplishments, but we should talk about all his, his failures too. The lack of leadership in with respect to the pandemic is just exceptional in American history. There's just this basic level of presidential leadership that he has simply not provided. The presidency was brought into the American political system in 1787 because there was a recognition that you need some kind of central authority to deal with crisis. If you want to really take the kind of overarching view here, Hobbes, the idea of the social contract, the government's responsibility is to tackle crises. And the way he has just handed this whole thing over to the states is just disgraceful. The way he does a hit job on his own. CDC, Anthony Fauci, the guy who does the government, the medical response to the approach to the pandemic. I think it's just a stunning failure of leadership, what we've seen in the pandemic, of just historical proportions.
I agree.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later, how that's affecting the election. But I wanted to touch on healthcare because there's a lot of talk always about healthcare when we talk about American politics. And I was wondering if you could try to explain why healthcare is such a big issue. And also, one of my big questions is how Republicans, I cannot get a grasp on what Republicans actually want as far as healthcare. They want to repeal and replace was one of Trump's main election promises. He wanted to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something else. They tried to do it in Congress, they failed. They're trying to do it through the Supreme Court. But there is nothing to replace it with. So what's the deal with healthcare?
Well, it's a pretty complex issue, and Trump said so himself. He never understood the complexity of healthcare once he came into the office, so he kind of speaks to that specifically. I think that the general picture is such that you have the Democratic Party who tends to voters who need healthcare more than voters of the Republican Party. Many of those do that too, but the Republican Party is partly also in the pocket of the big pharmaceutical companies and the moneyed interest. They want to have the current system in place because it pays off dramatic profits to those who are organizing that part of the system. So that's a big move, the big picture, as I can see it. The other thing with it is the difficulty of killing an American basic understanding that in order to succeed, it's up to you as a person. We know that you cannot succeed as a person on your own because you need everything that's around you. But that's like a basic understanding. It has to be individualism in one way or another. And then I point to the so-called American dream. If you really work hard and if you really can show that you have the personal strengths, then you will succeed. But it's called, as one comedian said, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. So it doesn't work. But the idea is still there, so strong of individualism that the government should hold back its effort to help individual persons. So we have that tension in addition, whether you should leave it to individuals, partly to states, or the degree to which the republic, the federal government should stand back and let things just develop as they can.
But you also had, for a period of time, let's say in the post-war years, you had a lot of people with good jobs that got good health insurance in the auto industry, for instance, and they got good private health insurance, right? So what they saw was a good private health system and a not so good public health system for poor people. So do you have this idea that in order to get the best, it can't be done by the government. And this idea, I think, prevails today. It makes it harder for Democrats to sell this Medicare for all deal.
Yeah, and you basically have two forms of kind of government programs. You have programs that you pay into yourself, like Social Security, which are very popular programs. Social Security is basically the old age pension system, and the Medicare system, which is healthcare for retired folks, seniors. Those programs are extremely popular, and nobody would even dare to do anything to them. But then you have programs, or what do you call welfare programs, which are programs that you don't have to pay into in order to kind of enjoy the benefits of, like Medicaid, which is healthcare for poor people. It's not great healthcare. It varies by state. So those programs are generally seen as the programs that Democrats promote. And for the Democratic electorate, African Americans, low income folks, the handout program, the handouts, you don't have to contribute in order to get onto these programs. So those are extremely unpopular with much of the country. So it's important to kind of distinguish between different welfare program or public.
So just to recap, programs. You have Medicaid for poor people, and Medicare for older.
Yeah. And Social Security, old age pension. Yeah.
And also,
and this is also why the economy is such a big issue, because Americans don't have a welfare state like we do in Norway. So they're that much more dependent on their jobs because they get a lot of these kind of social services through their employment. So that's why the economy is such a big issue, because it really matters whether or not the economy is roaring or not.
Because if you lose your job, you lose your health insurance. So you are bad off in two ways.
So I was giving a lecture about American individualism to the Progress Party last year, and I asked them, what does libertarianism have to offer if life goes downhill? So that's like my basic, I don't want to get political, but that's like, I think that's really the basic way of kind of getting to it. Or that's the most important question here. Everything is going to be fine if you have employment, but if you don't have employment, you're in trouble.
But is there a way Joe Biden and all the Democrats basically had some sort of expansion of Obamacare or going into Medicare for All, which is Sanders' plan. And looking at their plans, I can't really see how they don't explain how they're going to get from the current system to a system that is more like the one we have here. And you have a healthcare system which is highly capitalistic, which is a big part of the market, the financial market. So you would take a chunk of the market basically and make it into a government property. It could tank the market. So how do you even do it? Is it possible? Yes.
I had a conversation many decades ago with Errol Wadowski, a famous political scientist in the States, and he told me there are two bad things you can do in politics. One, ask for something and get it, and ask for something and get it, and don't like what you get. So the point is for people to ask for something more than they can receive, because then there's always a way out of saving face for asking for something. And I think the Democrats are really in a tight spot in order to explain how they would eventually move up to whatever single payer system they want to head toward.
Yeah.
I mean, we know from a small, cozy national state that it works, but the United States is so much different in so many different ways that a single payer system is hard to implement, given the
Can you
entrenched.
explain a single payer system real quick?
Okay, a single payer system is that there is one actor ultimately who takes care of the expenses of Medicare, even though you have exchanges between individuals, insurance companies, or health providers. There's one actor toward the end who's responsible for it all. And in our country, it would be the government. In other countries, it could be somebody else who they agree to take the position of the single payer. But all these kind of actors in between have so much interest in the system that they will fight to the death for preventing anything to fix the system. Let me just have one example. The system is such that if the three of us go to a restaurant and we order something and then we eat and then we leave, and we don't know how much it costs, because those who own the restaurant charge those who brought the food for the bill, and they agree among themselves and they send the bill to us. So we're not involved in the understanding the prices or the price mechanisms. There are people behind the scenes who organize between themselves to establish the price, and we're screwed.
I think I wanted to touch on foreign policy before we go into the election nuts and bolts. And you've mentioned it, both of you, a little bit. But one thing that Trump has done, as far as I can tell, more than his predecessors, is that he's used America's financial muscles, economic muscles, in a lot of ways. He started trade wars. He has increased sanctions, but he's also threatened to ruin, like he threatened Turkey to ruin their economy if they attack the Kurds after they pulled out. He's used it in multiple ways. Is this a strategy, a foreign policy strategy that you think has been efficient, effective?
No, I don't think so. I think that Trump has totally misunderstood the tough guy relationship in business in New York City from international relations. That is a totally different topic. On trade and his trade wars, ask yourself, do you have a trade deficit with a dentist? The answer is yes. But that doesn't matter, because the dentist is related to other people who provide something and to others. So in the balance, you have a surplus and you have a deficit. So don't isolate a foreign relationship with a country simply because of the deficit. You have to see the whole picture. And Trump has moved out of international institutions that provided security and calm in the Western world roughly since 1945, and he's pulling out of them. And the worst thing he does now is to pull out of WHO, the World Health Organization, in a sense of his America First showing strength. But what happens is that China moves in to those empty seats in that organization. And not only do they occupy those seats, they also implement their understanding and the language they need in order to dominate where the United States is pulling back. So I think he might have some accomplishments, he might have some gains, but the overall picture is a Western guarantees of the whole system is pulling out, and that's troubling.
Do you think that he's done permanent damage to the rules-based order?
Good question. I think we have to wait to see. But there's the indications a bit bad so far. Yes.
Hilmar, you mentioned the Middle East. Do you think Trump can take credit for beating back ISIS?
Yes, he can, because he's given the generals a lot more leeway. I mean, you can like it, you can dislike it, but he has done that. And the way he has taken out certain people, he has done it in a much more aggressive way, which I think in a kind of vulgar way actually enhances the kind of not just the carrot but the stick aspect of the presidency. When Barack Obama drew his red line and didn't enforce it, that really hurt American credibility in the world. So the way his kind of bold move on this Iranian general al-Baghdadi, these things are useful in a way too, in terms of just raising the credibility of the American president. I'm not defending it, but he has kind of followed up in a way that Barack Obama didn't always do. But I totally agree. He has, he doesn't have any sense of kind of the idealist tradition of American foreign policy, the concept of an alliance, the way that, the idea that you do something for somebody and they'll help you some farther down the road. He doesn't have any kind of idea of that dimension of foreign policy, the soft power, the institutions. But there's something too, I think, his willingness to kind of upset the apple cart. What's happening now with Israel and these Arab nations, it's primarily happening because of two reasons. Because the Arab countries can tell that America is withdrawing from the world and has been withdrawing since 2008, basically. Obama said it's time to do some nation building at home. And secondly, because of Iran's aggression in the region. So those are the main reasons for why the Arabs and Israelis are now talking. But the fact that it's happening in the open and not just behind the scenes, that's significant in a way.
Significant in a good way? Do you think you said earlier that we will see the effects of the Middle East for a long time?
Yeah, I don't see Joe Biden moving the American embassy back to Tel Aviv from Jerusalem. I don't see him trying to reverse what's happening now between Israel and the Arab countries. I don't see Joe Biden trying to turn that around. So in that sense, it's significant. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out, but it's what Trump said he would do, trying to kind of shift American foreign policy or get into some other kind of mode.
But the question, U.S. already had a consulate in Jerusalem. So have they technically moved or just upgraded the consulate to an embassy? Because I asked the guy in front of that consulate last year when I was there, what happens? Well, he didn't commit to any kind of answer, but it's kind of tricky. So Biden doesn't necessarily have to reverse the process, just not continue the process, because they already have a presence in Jerusalem.
But more symbolically, I think they could operate just as easily out of Tel Aviv. I was there last year, so I stopped outside of the U.S. embassy in Jerusalem, and it looked very embassy like to me. I don't know, but I think the importance of it is just the symbolic aspect to it.
My last question, and Trump still, I think, hopes he will get the Nobel Peace Prize somewhat, but he has, though, made it harder, I think, for future presidents to intervene militarily in other countries. He's been very clear on that, and it is consistent with the wish of a lot of the American people. They don't want to keep sending their young men and women out to pointless wars. So has he sort of finished off the neoconservative Bush doctrine movement on the right side of American politics? Is that dead and gone, or can that reappear?
I think the key word you just gave was Bush, because George W. Bush made one of the most badly strategic moves in U.S. foreign policy by going to war to Iraq and continues their presence in Afghanistan, and then have kept the United States presence in the Middle East and cost so much money, and was one of the reasons why Bush was so unpopular at the end of his 8 years. So I think that experience, that historical legacy of George W. Bush is the one that Trump has picked up and understood that there's nothing to be gained to expand anymore. The United States has still presence in roughly 150 countries around the world militarily in one way or another. So it's not that they have vacated the whole area, but they're kind of the gung-ho attempt of moving in and occupying and doing some kind of military stuff has ended in a sense. Now they're back to different kind of instruments in international politics.
Well, at least for the time being. If this was the Second World War, I mean, think about the Afghanistan war in Afghanistan. If this was this, if that had been like the Second World War, we would have been in 1960 now. That's how long it's been going on. So there's always this kind of nationalistic impulse after long wars. We saw it after the Vietnam War too, all the way up until George Bush, when it got Saddam Hussein out of Iraq, and Americans kind of got their mojo back in terms of believing in their own military powers and all of that. But obviously, the big difference now is China rising. We're moving towards a multipolar world, so that's going to be a huge factor.
So is this the beginning of the end of America's superpower reign, do you think?
Yes, I think so, to a point. And one of the reasons is that the United States no longer has the same economic power that it used to have. I mean, we saw the headlines a couple of weeks ago, months ago, that the national debt is equal to the size of the economy, which hasn't happened until after the Second World War. But after the Second World War, they had a tremendous economic growth for 2 or 3 decades, which paid off the debt. But now they have borrowed so much money, and I don't think they still have the resources. I'm not sure that they have the will to go into costly wars in that sense anymore. There are different calculations behind those policies.
So let's turn to the upcoming election. And there's one question that I get all the time, and I'm sure you guys get it all the time. And people want to know, can we trust the polls? So.
Yeah, well, yes and no, in the sense that, like take for example Nate Silver, he'll be the first guy to tell you that we don't know. I mean, the polling industry itself doesn't know what it doesn't know. Unknowns. And in 2016, nobody anticipated that the so-called undereducated would be underrepresented in the polling samples. We don't know if there's going to be a new kind of error that we haven't seen before. But at the same time, national polls were actually quite accurate in 2016. National polls were accurate. There was a state level polling that was bad. And this year, there's just a whole lot more state level polling. And they have tried to correct the mistakes. Also, this year, we're going to see a record turnout, probably 150 million people voting, up from about 138 last year. Everybody expects a historic turnout. So that probably makes polling more reliable, because the electorate is actually going to look, or the electorate is going to look a lot more like the samples that we're using now to predict, I mean, in terms of polling. So a higher turnout means more reliable polling, probably. But it was in part polling error in 2016, but it's also that the race closed late. There's actually a shift in the last few days, weeks, towards Trump. So there was a shift that probably accounted for about 3 percentage points, and a polling error that accounted for about 3 percentage points. Which explains how Hillary could lead by 7% percentage points and still lose. So yes, we can trust the polls, but we don't know how good they are.
Was that the event when FBI declared they're going to have renewed investigation into Hillary's email?
Well, there were just a number of things. Nobody knows really what explained. I mean, in that kind of a setting, it could be anything. But Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden is not Hillary Clinton. Trump has a record to run on, and there is a 1 in 5 chance that Trump could pull this off, which is not a insignificant chance.
But in a normal election year, you have an incumbent who's done pretty well with the economy, even if it is by borrowing money and expanding the deficit. But so normally he would be pretty in a good position.
Yeah.
So, Gunnar, when you look at the polls now, they're tightening a little bit in some swing states. What do you see? Do you see a landslide, or do you see something that's going to be very tense and tight?
Well, I don't follow it as closely as you two do, but my sense is that if Biden has a 9, 10, 11-point lead in the national polls, that should tell something, even though we have differences at the state level. It might come to the point, maybe in a week or so, if this continues, and so many people have already voted, and the surveys polls are stable, they're going to go back to what we experienced in 2008, that the Democrats could even put a Mickey Mouse on their ticket and win the election against their opponent. I mean, it's so skewed today that there's no way that this can be reversed. The thing about those who do the polls has a methodological aspect, because they are making a snapshot of where they are today while the ground is moving. And they're going to follow the ground as it moves until election day. And then they would have the population results on election day with their sample, and then they can do the methodological fine-tuning to improve their instruments next time. It won't be perfect, but it will be better. So they learn from mistakes. And you said incumbency. Normally, a president running for re-election after the party's first 4 years in the White House would almost win hands down. But we didn't see that with George Bush in 2004, and we didn't see that as easily with Obama in 2012, because the effect of incumbency is almost gone. We had Eisenhower, we had Johnson, we had Reagan, partly Nixon, who really blasted the results with their re-election. But that is an historic effect that is basically gone.
Yeah, it's kind of paradoxical. As a campaign tool, it's not as effective as it was the presidency. At the same time, the American presidency is more powerful than it has ever been in history relative to the other institutions. So in that way, presidents are more powerful than they have ever been before in terms of the way they rely on the executive powers. On the other hand, it's not that important anymore in terms of elections, probably. But we've seen a number of cases where incumbents have lost when they have failed to deal with crises. Jimmy Carter, best recent example, George Bush, 1992. People had kind of lost belief in him and in his ability to turn around the economy. And Hoover, 1932. And if you want to go all the way back to the 1850s, Buchanan. When presidents fail to deal with crises, that can account for as much as maybe 5% percentage points for the opponent.
So one of the big issues in 2016 was what they call shy Trump voters. So that's the people who say to the pollsters that they're going to vote for Clinton, and then they go and they vote for Trump, but they don't tell anyone. And some analysts think that this was a big issue in 2016, a big reason why the polls were wrong. Some of them still think that there is a sizable chunk of shy voters out there today. But that's very contested. And I'm wondering what you think of that, Hilmar.
Maybe, at the margins, but, the Trump campaign is now, that's kind of like that's what they're hoping is going to happen again. And that's going to lead to this landslide victory repeat of 2016. But when you think about it, why do a lot of people vote for Trump? Well, allegedly he's, at least some of them, Trump is this tough guy. He's this macho guy, the pinnacle of manliness. He'll hit you back 10 times harder, even though if you were a mom of a soldier who died in Iraq, he's still gonna, if you assault, he's just super, super aggressive, tough guy. So if that's why you're voting for Trump, but you don't have yourself the internal fortitude to tell some random pollster that you're going to vote for Trump, it doesn't seem, it's kind of laughable to me
But
that
the
they don't
argument,
dare to tell a pollster
but the
themselves.
argument, I guess, is that it's not those guys. It's not, because what you're describing now is sort of the Trump base, but that you might have the guy, successful guy living in the suburbs, who cares about the economy, doesn't want to pay taxes, doesn't really like Democrats, but his neighbors maybe don't want to hear him say that he's going to.
Yeah, it's social desirability bias. We know it can
Yeah.
happen, but as I said initially, I think it's just more at the margins. It's not going to be a factor to the extent that the Trump campaign is kind of relying on it.
What do you think?
The curse of the two-party system, if you dislike one party and have voted for the other, and you come to the next election and you have some doubts, there's no other place to go. I mean, if you don't like the other party, why should you go there? Why should you stick to one you already have? Mm-hmm. I talked to a businessman in Indiana in February, and he said, I voted for Trump in 2016, not so much for Trump, but I voted against Hillary. And if you have that kind of dichotomy, that kind of tension in voters, and if you're committed to Trump 4 years ago and you don't like the liberals or the Democrats, there's nowhere else to go.
So I've been wondering about that. If Trump loses, like a lot of people think he will do, what happens to all these MAGA people? Because what you really have today is you have four parties, right? You have the Sanders crowd, you have the Trump crowd, and then you have the traditional Democratic and Republican parties. So can you see this becoming an actual split and becoming a multi-party system, or is it just too entrenched?
The party system is extremely entrenched in combination of the electoral system and the fact that the highest price in US politics is the one presidency. So those two factors really force it into a two-party system. But you may have a number of different factions within the parties. But if you want to succeed in politics, you have to choose one of the two parties and then survive in the primaries and then come on a ticket, and then you can do your policies once you're inside the party. But in that process, there are mechanisms for selections. But the party, as you rightly point out, those are very different factions in one tent. And you always have that going on.
Yeah, in the 1930s, you had Jews, communists, African Americans, and the Ku Klux Klan in the same party, the Democratic Party. Just to remind ourselves that these really are these broad coalitions. But we have two so-called independent senators now, and so that goes to show, and one independent Congress representative. So that goes to show that I think it's possible if you start winning suburbs as independent, maybe you decide that you're just going to give yourself a party name. So I think it can happen, and particularly if the nationalists, the Josh Hawleys, the Tom Cottons, the Don Juniors. And the Matt Gaetz, those people, they're not going to go away. So there's an audience, these die-hard MAGA, their leader type of folks. There's an audience now for Fox News. There's institutions that have emerged in the Trump era. So there's a whole ecosystem now of nationalists. They're not going to go away. So I think it's a party split is possible.
So before we turn to questions, I think another thing that people are worried about and think about a lot is what's going to happen on Election Day and what's going to happen in the week after Election Day. Trump has not been, he's been asked multiple times to confirm that he will accept a peaceful transfer of power. He hasn't been able to really answer that fully. And there are some analysts worrying that it may appear on Election Day as though Trump is the winner, because a lot of Trump voters will go and vote on November 3rd. But as they count the mail-in ballots, as they count, that might change. But what happens if Trump on election night has a slight lead and declares victory, what happens then?
There's no specific outcome that speaks to that because it's totally unprecedented. I mean, if you have a leader of a country who at the end of the day or the week or the election month obviously has lost the election and refuses to concede, that's totally unprecedented. And it violates all the traditions in the United States since the first president came and left. So that alone should almost be an impeachable offense to undermine and to challenge a democracy so hard and so bluntly in the guts. It should be done something about it. That won't happen. But I am, and as you pointed out correctly, Christina, there is this something called the blue wave, that those who have absentee ballots or mail-in votes, when they are counted after election day, they are having, for the last couple of election cycles, they are increasingly Democratic votes. And if you see an election day, you have a certain outcome. And then over the next couple of days, maybe a week and a half, depending on for how long they will count them, you've got an increasing proportion of Democratic votes. If Trump decides to go to that and say, I have won, let's just cancel the count, it's going to be really nasty and bad.
And it might end up in the Supreme Court.
Yes.
So there are basically two critiques of Trump. One is that he's this kind of aspiring autocrat. This is the Weimar Republic, 1933. Trump wants to stay in power, but I don't worry about that because Trump, he doesn't have the commitment. He's not committed to an agenda. He doesn't have an agenda, a strategy, a plan for staying in power. Autocrats have a plan and a strategy and a commitment to staying in power. Trump doesn't have that. He's just vain. I think Trump is basically, he's not an autocrat, he's a grifter. He's incompetent. His concern about losing the elections is, again, just about vanity. He has this primal fear of looking like a loser. So that's good, because it would be a lot worse if he had actually been, a genuine, respectable autocrat.
A real autocrat.
A real autocrat. But that's not Trump. He's just vain. So that means that he'll listen. He doesn't want it enough to put up a fight in that kind of way. He'll be pushed out of by the party, like Nixon was pushed out by Republicans. And there's no requirement that legal requirement that a president accepts defeat. If the states run the elections, if they conclude that Biden has won, Trump will automatically lose all the powers of the office at noon, January 20th. And at that point, he's just a trespasser. He'll be let out in handcuffs. It's not up to Trump whether or not he gets to stay in office. It's not up to him. He doesn't get to decide.
So you said the party will throw him under the bus, I guess. And people have been waiting for this for a long time. A lot of people have said this has to be the line. This has to be the line. The Republicans can't accept this, but they've pushed that line and pushed it and pushed it and pushed it. So do you think that they will stand up to him if you get a situation like this? You think Mitch McConnell, there's no love lost between them.
Yeah.
No, once that Trump cannot hurt them anymore, they will just let him go. But as long as he can hurt them, as long as he can pay back and have his Twitter torpedoes coming, and he can hurt them, they will stay behind him. But the moment that has flips, they will just let him go.
The generals will not, take any orders that are illegal. So Republicans behind the scenes, they'll be, celebrating him as this kind of world historic genius on TV. But if you talk to them behind the scenes, they'll admit that this guy is totally unfit for office. So they'll drop him like a hot something. I think they'll drop him at an instant.
Let's take some questions. I'm sure there are some. There we go.
Hi. Hello. Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion. I want actually to pick up on this last part you were talking about regarding the Republican Party, and specifically the older veterans that at least to my impression, have changed dramatically in terms of how they perceive Trump from before he was elected and until he came to office. So, and also this speaks a little bit back to sort of the successes or failures of Trump. But how would you characterize the relationship between the Trump administration and figures, veterans like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and so on and so forth?
Those who are reached the level of being members of Congress, House of the Senate, have sufficient cynicism and knowledge and rationality to understand when they can gain from a situation and when they will lose from a situation. And that's an ongoing calculus that they have all the time. And of course, as Christina said, they can hate each other badly. They can yell at each other at the meetings. But as long as they know that they're tied to one another, they coordinate sufficiently to get their preferred outcome. But if that doesn't add up anymore, and if the downside is larger than the upside, then they would let something go. That's my overall question, if that was an answer to it. Yeah,
it's a marriage of convenience, basically. So yeah, I'll just repeat what I just said a few minutes ago, but well, sure.
Well, I think one important factor that changed American politics is the internet. And you saw that with the Tea Party. The Tea Party started organizing via the internet. And what happened was, when the Tea Party started challenging Republicans in the primaries, they could use the internet to fundraise nationally. So you would have a congressman or a senator that suddenly had a challenger with 10 times the amount of money and support, because he could use the internet to sort of harness that anger and whatever that they had. And Eric Cantor was thrown out of Congress in that way. And I think both Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell, they are acutely aware that if they go against Trump, they will get a challenge. They will get a primary challenge from the MAGA people, and MAGA people from all over America will pay into that campaign. So that's, I think, also that's the dagger over their heads.
Historically, if you lose an election, you're damaged goods. There's taint on your skin if you don't get reelected. And that's why Trump is so worried about not getting reelected. So you're damaged good. And Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, a lot of folks, Mike Pence, there's a lot of folks who want to kind of pick up the mantle and be the next leader. So those guys are not just going to sit back. They're willing to do it as long as he's in office. But as you said, when they have a shot at the prize themselves, they're going to put up a fight.
Yeah, thank you so much for an interesting discussion. I just wanted to pick up on, you discussed briefly like the civil war within the Republican Party. So as of now, the Republican Party are losing the popular vote and depend somewhat on voter suppression. I was just wondering, given the demographic change in the United States, which direction do you think the Republican Party would like to go? To try to include more demographic groups or more towards voter suppression?
That's a great question.
There was this autopsy report after 2012 in the Republican Party that said that we got to do something. We had to win an election since they weren't able to do so for the presidential election 2012. And then the strategy of the party was that we need to include more groups, more quote unquote minority groups, women, ethnic groups, racial groups. And then that was a platform. And to the party's surprise, here comes Trump. And he wins on the basis of disregarding that whole autopsy report. And many white voters, with all due respect, were relieved. They said, well, now we don't have to pretend to be honest anymore. We can just go for the winning side. But we know from reading the demographics that the whites in the United States are getting a smaller proportion over the overall population. And even if the Democrats continue on the same direction and stick to their big tent of groups that they attract, they will win dramatically. And Christina just said before we started here that Texas is now in play for the outcome of the election. I mean, this would be a dramatic change in electoral history. And Trump was able to hold on to the white hope for the last election, but I think that's a hope that will vanish very quickly for the Republican Party unless they have another very serious autopsy report.
In party theory, I guess the conventional wisdom is that parties adapt. But as you just gave an example of the opposite. And after 4 years after Democrats lost in 1980, Democrats nominated the vice president of the president who lost. So that goes to show that parties don't always learn. On the other hand, the fact that Trump was able to take the Republican Party in this new direction goes to show that party leaders really can go in and change parties, forceful party leaders, and great party leaders or presidents get the opportunity to reshape their parties. And so a new kind of forceful personality can actually take the Republican Party in some, yet again, new direction. And I just say that Republicans, well, this time it looks like Trump is going to get a higher share of the African-American vote than he did 4 years ago. He's going to get a higher share of the Latino vote than he did 4 years ago. And the Latino vote is much more diverse than we kind of think of it as. Colombianos, Cubanos, people from Central America, extremely culturally diverse group. And they vote much more socioeconomically than African Americans, who tend to, there's no concept of class in at least in parts of in America. African Americans vote ethnically. They don't vote as a class, social class. That's why Bernie Sanders had so limited appeal among African Americans. They vote ethnically, but Latinos don't. They vote much more socioeconomically, which is why Bush won 40% of the Latino vote in 2004. And
meaning as Latinos get richer, they
they vote they vote as highly educated voters. They vote in terms of their economic interests, socioeconomically, to a greater extent than African Americans. So that goes to show that Republicans, and the door is not shut in terms of appealing to new demographics.
Anyone else?
Yes, we have a question from Zoom. If Democrats win, what should they do to help shift rural America away from Trumpism?
To shift rural America away from Trumpism? Oh, that's a good question.
What to do with all the MAGA supporters, I guess, is the question.
Well, I have great respect for the hardworking people of the Midwest because I travel extensively in the Midwest. So, but it baffles me that they should be so closely related to a president that in some respects contradicts their values. But I think that when you can present this better, when you have parties that present different outcomes, different alternatives, I think that might change. I wouldn't use the term rescue, but I just want to accept that people have the preferences, their priorities, and they vote accordingly. And they just vote whatever way they think they should benefit. But the Midwest gets a lot of subsidies from the government in terms of farming. And there are different types of, churches, religion, small communities that are different from the loud voices in New York City and Los Angeles. So they feel different. And Trump has been there and the Republicans have been there for them.
Trump is as much a symptom as a cause for this new nationalism. Before Trump, there was Louis Gohmert of Texas. There was Steve King of Iowa. These folks would meet I shouldn't say regularly, but meet from time to time with the leaders of European radical right parties like Geert Wilders and the leader of whose name escapes me of AfD in Germany. So you would have these nationalists that weren't really name players that still had close contacts, were in contact with European and radical right party representatives, party leaders. So there's always going to be about 30% of the electorate that represents those values, and they're always going to be there, and we have to recognize that and just kind of respect it in a way. So this is Trump's appeal is cultural. He won because he represented. He didn't take over the party. He won because he represented the Republican base in a much more effective way than any other candidate. That's why Trump won.
But also, I mean, the candidates keep promising the Midwest that industry is coming back, manufacturing. Biden has the same thing in his program, his plan. And so they're constantly being promised something that's not going to happen. And I think was it Obama who said, you know, it's not coming back. I think he said and
which
there
is
was
true.
a huge, which is true,
Yeah.
but there was a huge outcry and they had to sort of walk that back. But what you see now is people moving in droves from the north to the south. So you have also this geographical shift, I think, where people will physically move away, and maybe when they get to Texas or Arizona, or that will also change the dynamics of their voting identity, maybe.
Two quick points. We're talking about this individualistic culture, this anti-statism, and also this low social trust, the low trust in institutions. It's just hugely paradoxical that this country of individualism and anti-statism and kind of lack of trust in institutions have now mobilized behind these great leaders. There's this extreme distrust in institutions and this extreme trust in leaders, these great men, Obama and then Trump. It's just very paradoxical. And also, the presidency has never been more powerful, and never has the gap been greater between the requirements of the office and the people who actually obtain the office. I'm talking particularly about Trump again. The qualities required by the presidency are not usually qualities that get you elected as a candidate. You have to be a great communicator, a demagogue in a way. So there's this huge gap between the requirements of running for president and the requirements of the actual office. So all of this is just going to set people up for a lot more disappointment.
And that's a really important point, because after 1968, you started having primaries in all states. And with the internet coming, you need so much money. You need, it's favoring people like Obama, like Trump.
These charismatic, great
yeah.
communicators.
Yeah.
That's one important point that we kind of may easily forget about the United States, is that there are two basic mechanisms in elections. One is the primary, and one is the main cycle in fall. But the mechanisms in the primary is such that in order to win the primary, you attract candidates who win primaries, but may not have the qualities to run the actual office when they are elected. So those are two things pointing in different directions.
The gap is just growing.
It's growing. So if you're a good campaigner, you may not be a good president.
Populists fail in office all the time. Populists fail. Some learn, some adapt, a lot of them fail. Just setting the system up for more disappointment, more tension. So that's the end of American democracy in 20 years. Yeah.
Yes, another question from Zoom. Could the independence of the Electoral College come into play? And how many states do have a law that obliges the Electoral College to follow the popular vote in their state?
Ooh, that's a technical question.
Very technical. Independence in the Electoral College, I don't think there are that many. You can actually count them. And
I know there are some states that I think they are tied to the...
So the Supreme Court actually just ruled on this summer, I believe, or it was last. I mean, the years blend into one another. It was this year or last year. Yeah, and they said that it's up to a state whether or not you want to bind the electors to the outcome of the popular vote. In 2016, there were 10 electors who defected. I believe Colin Powell, the general, foreign secretary of state, won 5 electoral votes. So there were 10 people who defected in 2016. So if there's a tie, 269 this year, who knows what's going to happen?
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
There is a lot of talk in the media about a possibility of armed revolt. You see all the white extremists with their weapons, which of course is a lot of gets a lot of coverage in our media. What is the possibility of a new revolution with arms?
Well, we're seeing those episodes from the media that there are some pockets of, excuse me, lunatics who go around there armed all from a handgun to an automatic something, who think they can achieve something. But that's just stupid when they face the federal government who wants to, knock down any kind of uprising or riots. But it will happen because it has happened and it will happen again. But my sense is those pockets will be so small and so contained, they won't get any traction at all.
Yeah, and if you're an undergrad in political science, the first thing you learn is that a state is a monopoly of violence. But that monopoly has never been absolute or total in the United States because of the Second Amendment. There's always these militias or these militia type civic organizations, all these new groups appearing that are able to carry weapons in the street because of the Second Amendment. So you're going to have, we're not going to go back to Moscow in 1993 with tanks rolling the streets, shelling Congress. That's not going to happen because that's not in the culture, I hope. But you could have limited episodes of violence because there's this aggression, this angst on both sides now, and you have a president just encouraging it, which makes him so unfit for office. So limited episodes of violence, yeah, but cooler heads will prevail, I believe.
The one thing I fear is that if we don't get a landslide in this election, and the prayer of the election committee workers is, please God, give us a landslide.
Yeah.
If that landslide does not arrive, we will be within what's called the margin of litigation.
Yeah.
And I think that the lawyers can do much more harm nationally, harm in terms of perpetuating the final outcome of the election, than you have this kind of marginal lunatics with weapons. Yeah. So I think if that wave of litigation picks up in each state where you have protracted processes that is hard to finalize, that would be a really hard problem, which might come back to, as you said, to the Supreme Court. That's the final arbiter in those kind of conflicts. And it has happened before.
In 2008, Al Franken, former senator from Minnesota, won after a 62-day recount. In 2008, 62 days. He at first lost apparently, but then was a recount and he won. So that is what we could be looking at. And if there's no winner by January 20th, Nancy Pelosi will become acting or president, actually.
And actually, the Supreme Court just made one decision this week, or they didn't, because they were 4-4. But Pennsylvania has already. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court has already decided that they can count votes, mail-in votes, if they are post-stamped on the day of the election for 3 days. Mm-hmm. But you could see in the Supreme Court that they were split. So you had Roberts, who is the Chief Justice, side with the liberals. But once Amy Coney Barrett is on the bench, they will probably be 5-4 in most of those recount questions. So the Supreme Court might eventually be the ones deciding this election.
Yeah, thanks for your very interesting talks. My name is Bjarte Bjørsvik. 2 quick questions. I wonder about the split in the American population. Seems huge from over here. Has it historically been this huge before? And the second is, back in 2016, Hillary seemed to lead with less than what Biden is doing now. So what do you give on that?
I can take the first question. Okay, on the first question, yes, the United States has been this polarized in terms of population and Congress, but that's only one rare incident as far as I can tell, and it resulted in the Civil War in 1861. After that point, it has been oscillating, but it has been picking up maybe in the same type of pattern for the last 30 years. So polarization is real and it has consequences, but we don't know the ultimate consequences of the current polarization yet.
Yeah, and second question, yeah. Well, Hillary, that was about his lead, right? Hillary Clinton and Hillary Clinton didn't have a stable lead in 2016. It fluctuated. It peaked after the so-called Access Hollywood tape, at which point it was about where Biden is now. That was Hillary's peak. Biden has led by more or less 7, 8, 9 points stably throughout the year. So absent some major polling error and the race closing late, I don't think it's going to close late like it did in 2016, because all these people have been voting since September 6th. So it looks better than it did for Biden in than it did for Hillary in 2016. And she was a flawed candidate, and he's just not flawed in the same way. He's a lot less hated than Hillary Clinton. So and Trump is not running on his promises anymore. He's running on a record that's all not that great, at least in terms of the pandemic. So Biden is in better shape than Hillary was.
All right. So I think we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Gunnar. Thank you, Hilma.
Thank you.
And we'll see what happens, I guess, as Trump says.
Thank you.